Hi there. I've got a First Page Friday book for you, a book that I would recommend writers read. I think that this is a piece that can be very valuable to you as a writer, especially if you are writing a memoir. So the piece that I have for you today is They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. So, what's very different about this book is that it's a graphic novel. This is not your standard memoir where you've got, a couple hundred pages of kind of biography mixed with narrative. Instead, what you have here is, I'll show you what it looks like on the page. You've got this graphic novel, which looks a bit like a comic book. My son reads comic books a lot, and this has that similar feel to it, that similar look to it. This is all in black and white, this piece. The artist included a significant amount of depth to the drawings. They aren't in that kind of unrealistic sense that you get from comic books you might from, Spider-Man and that sort of thing. These are very human looking, in that you get that real sense of truth and emotion and that are coming through in the narrative. Now, I think that the most important thing about this book, besides the narrative itself, besides the experiences that George Takei is explaining here, is the way that he has intertwined multiple stories together. And I think that that's the real takeaway for memoir writers. What you have is you have him talking about his experience as a 4-year-old boy, being taken from his home during World War II and forced to go live in a Japanese internment camp. If you don't know, during World War II, the United States forced 120,000 Japanese Americans to abandon their homes and businesses and their possessions and to go live in internment camps, which were uh, not particularly comfortable living situations. So he talks about his experience from a child's perspective of what that was like. He also talks about his parents' perspective. He reflects back on what her experience was like and his dad's experience. The other thing that he does, which I think is really masterful, is that on top of talking about his own experience, he also integrates the words from legal documents throughout the piece. So the executive orders, things that were stated in the newspaper, things that were said by government officials, the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as well as senators and governors and so forth. He's got statements from them in the piece that are integrated. And I think it really adds this extra depth to the story itself because as a child, he's only able to tell one experience as being 4 to 8 years old when this thing is happening. But by then going back and researching and finding out what was happening in California, how were non-Japanese Americans communicating with Japanese Americans, how was that going? What was it like for people who weren't in his family, but still in the same situation, going through the loss of home, the loss of possessions, and so forth. And that just sense of crushing injustice that they experience, that these are people who are full citizens and they were completely disallowed their civil rights to be able to work and function and own the things that they owned, including their own homes. So what I'd like to do is to read the first portion for you. It's just the first couple of pages. Because there are so few words on the page, it really doesn't work for me to do a first page reading as I normally do with these videos, but rather I'll just do the first section, which is just a couple of pages. Where the story begins is where George's dad comes into where George and his younger brother Henry are sleeping, wakes them up and gets them up because they are leaving their home immediately. They're leaving their home that minute. And then from that place forward, you have the story of their experience with being forced to move, the internment camps, and their experiences around that. So it starts here with his dad walking into the room. George, Henry, get up at once. Do we have to, Daddy? I'm Still yawn, sleepy. Get dressed quickly. What's going on? No time to explain. Wait in the living room while we finish packing. Bang, bang, bang. Takakuma Norman Tokei? Yes? Under Executive Order 9066, you are instructed to leave your home immediately. My family, I need to help them get ready. 10 minutes. Boys, wait here while I help your mother and sister. Then we'll bring the bags out to the driveway. What's going on? Where are we going? I don't know. I will never be able to forget that scene. And he has an image here of his mother standing holding her baby daughter in one hand and her sewing machine packed into a bag in the other hand. And then the next image that you have here is at TEDx Kyoto, where George Takei is talking about this experience of being forced to leave their homes. I really think that this book is incredibly valuable. I think it took me an hour and a half to read it, something like that. I think that this is really valuable for any memoir writer because you can see not just how he's able to integrate multiple aspects of the story together, but also how he's able to integrate imagery. Oftentimes with a memoir, you'll see the inclusion of photographs, drawings, charts, and graphs, maps, and so forth. Here he's doing all of those things. They're all hand created by the artists that he worked with on creating this piece here. But I think it's really interesting because you can get a real sense of which images and what type of images are most effective for telling that story, for bringing out the emotion, for adding in the depth and so forth. Another portion I'd like to read to you here is about the experience of what it was like before the Japanese Americans were forced from their homes, what that lead up was like, because there were multiple steps to this that I was unaware of where they were, they lost their farms, they lost their properties, they were seized by both the state and the federal governments. So we have this section here. Many of us had already lost much of what we owned. Immediately following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government had begun seizing the bank accounts and financial assets of anyone suspected of enemy activity. To them, enemy activity included Japanese Americans traveling outside the country after June 17, 1940. But in 1942, after Executive Order 9066, the financial assets, property, and businesses of nearly all Japanese Americans were seized. And then on the next page we have, from small treasures to large estates, we were forced to sell our property for a fraction of its worth. The government warned us Japanese American farmers who didn't maintain their crops until relocation would be treated as wartime saboteurs. Crops were then seized by private individuals at harvest time. In 1943, California passed a law that any farm equipment left behind could be seized by the state. So the state could keep it or sell it and profit either way. So this is how here he is integrating this sense of the layers of the story of what's going on here, and that it's not just the perspective of a 4-year-old little boy, but that there's a lot happening in the background that he couldn't see at the time, but now as an adult he's able to go back and research and recognize that depth of loss that occurred during this time period. Another thing that I really like that he included here is to acknowledge the difficulty of doing memoir writing, because I think all of us who engage in this kind of reflective writing recognize that it can be really tough, and that sometimes we are filling in the blanks, and sometimes we're not able to acknowledge all of where all the blanks are, and that this is a real challenge. So here he talks about the difficulty of that. Childhood memories are especially slippery, sweet, and so full of joy, they can often be a misrendering of the truth. For a child, that sweetness, out of context and intensely subjective, remains forever real. I know that I will always be haunted by the larger, vaguely remembered reality of the circumstances surrounding my childhood. So he's able as a writer to look back on his experiences and to recognize some of this is just hard to remember, that he's just got these big bits and pieces. And therefore, he's overlaying these other elements of story to tell that full picture of what occurred. And I think it adds so much depth to the story here. Another thing that he does is where he adds narrative to the background or exposition to the background where he tells what's going on. So for example, here, May 14th, 1944, Northern California. Camp to a Lake was a lot different than Rohrer. Not one layer of barbed wire fence, but three. The government had converted it into a maximum security segregation camp for disloyals, guarded by battle-ready troops, machine gun towers, and even tanks. George, why did we have to move here? Because Mommy and Daddy are no-nos. Oh, what's a no-no? Like our parents, many others had responded, no, no, on the loyalty questionnaire. A minority of people applied for repatriation, but few wanted to be sent to war-torn Japan, so we ended up here. All imprisoned, driven to outrage by a government's hysteria. Tule Lake was the most notorious, the most cruel, and by far the largest of the 10 camps. At its peak, this heavily militarized facility held 18,000 internees. Nearly half of them were kids like us. So this is an example here of where he goes back and takes this research that he's done around these experiences, around these events, and then lays it over his own experience of what it felt like to him to be forced to move from one camp to another. But from the historical perspective of why they were moving from one camp to another and what was the government's intention behind that and so forth. And that this was very much that they were seen as a very real threat and that they had machine guns and tanks surrounding this camp, where inside of it half of the people were children and the other half of the people were people who just disagreed with this questionnaire that they were asked to fill out, that had questions that didn't really tell their full story. So memoir writers, I definitely would recommend this book, They Called Us Enemy, by George Takei. I think that it allows a memoir writer to really see how to integrate multiple stories, multiple narratives into a single piece. It allows you to see how you can take a story from when you're very young and to integrate that historical perspective on top of it and tell this very full story by the end. So, and two, you've also got the graphic novel too. Again, it's not a piece that I typically reach for, as I would usually go for something that's more of a biographical type of piece. But this is fascinating. The way that he brings it all together, I think, is absolutely worth a look. So I hope you pick up the book and give it a read, and I hope that you get something out of it. Good luck with your writing.